Oh, goody.
Alright, what's going on everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today we got some new cards, new decks to take a look at, and this is our first kind of a double feature of a new card release. So if you haven't already heard, we have not one but two new cards dropping with the new season today. Skaar is going to be our Battle Pass card for the month. He is a 6/11 that reads, costs 2 less for each of your cards that has 10 or more power. And then Caiera is making her debut in this week's Spotlight Caches as a Series 5 card. He is a 3/4 with ongoing, your 1 and 6 cost cards can't be destroyed. So let's talk a little bit about the cards, the Spotlight week, and then we'll get into our day 1 decks. So starting off with Skaar, I think Skaar is a really cool card. The thing that is probably going to immediately come to people's minds is, how can I make this card cost nothing? And that is probably not going to realistically happen in the majority of games with this card. I think most realistically, this will often be a 4/11, which is pretty good. Generally pretty decent stats overall, and if you can get those games where you end up making it a 2/11, it seems really, really good. We have a nice little infographic here from Drewberry that gives you a little cheat sheet on all the ways you can get Skaar reduced cost, including all the base power 10 cards and the cards that will conditionally have 10 power. So pretty useful little thing if you're trying to figure out, what do I really want to build around with Skaar? I think there are a lot of ways you can build around this card looking at the cards listed, so it's one I'm pretty excited for. I think it's generally a pretty good card to have for a season pass. I don't think this card is necessarily going to define the metagame as much as maybe Miss Marvel or Loki or Elsa did, but I do think it's going to have a more significant impact and more interesting deck building than we saw with Shaw last month. So to me, that's a W, and I say it pretty much every month, but if you're going to be spending any money in Marvel Snap, the season pass is generally the way to go. You get by far the most bang for your buck in terms of all the other stuff, and you get a card and some nice cosmetics with it. So you only buy one thing, definitely make sure it is the season pass, and as far as season passes go, seems like a decent one. Then we have Caiera. So Caiera I don't think is the flashiest card out there, but essentially providing a armor effect for your whole board, only on your side for 1s and 6s, is a very powerful effect. Shang-Chi is as prominent as ever in the metagame, and for that reason, you often don't see people just slamming out their big cards early with ramp, because they just get taken down by Shang-Chi, with one of the exceptions here being Black Knight, who his Ebony Blade now has a way to avoid that Shang-Chi or Shadow King disruption. So Caiera is a card that I think she's pretty strong. She's not going to see play in the majority of decks because you obviously want either a bunch of 1s or a bunch of 6s or both to make the most use of this effect, but I do think the deck she goes into, she is going to be very, very helpful in. In terms of the Spotlight Cache week, I think this is actually a really, really good week if you are a new player or if you're just missing all of these cards. The combination of High Evolutionary and Nebula basically get you the High Evo deck out of the box for the most part. You don't need any other Pool 4 or 5 cards to play a High Evo deck. There are some Pool 3 ones that will help you, mainly Magic and She-Hulk, but aside from that, the High Evo deck is probably like the best it gets in terms of if you're a newer player to the game and you don't have a lot of cards. High Evo is kind of just like a deck in a box with one card because you have all the other basic cards for free. So High Evo, highly recommend if you are a newer player or if you're just looking for a different deck to play and you don't have it yet. High Evo makes this a great week. Nebula pairs very nicely with the High Evo deck, and they both pair nicely with Caiera. The High Evo deck plays some big 6-drops, it plays important 1-drops, so I do think that Caiera might make a splash in that archetype. I'm not sure if that's going to be the best home for her out of the bunch, but she does seem like she's going to be fighting Cosmo for that spot of protecting your valuable 1 and 6-drop cards. Now, if you already have High Evo and Nebula, since they've been around for a little bit, I think I would probably go the token route with Caiera, unless you're really interested in the variants. We do have the comic variant for High Evo, which is cool. The first one of those we're seeing enter the game. But in general, my rule of thumb is only open spotlights when you are missing at least 2 cards or 2 things you want. So if that doesn't apply to you, but you really still want Caiera, I'd probably go the tokens route. That's what I'm planning on doing as someone who already has the other cards. So yeah, both these cards are cool. I'm excited to try them out later today. And without further ado, let's take a look at our day 1 decks. So I had a lot of fun making decks for these two cards. I think they complement each other nicely, as you're going to want to get your big threats out early to help enable Skaar, and Caiera acts as a nice way of protecting those big threats, which is the main reason we usually don't want to cheat them out early, because we're worried the opponent is going to blow them up. We're starting off with the deck I am most excited for though, and that is the evolution of the Thanos Lockjaw deck. So Thanos Lockjaw has been kind of having a resurgence after Blob made his way into the game. The Professor X nerf did hurt it a little bit, but the deck still seems to be going pretty strong, and we just made some slight adjustments to it to take advantage of the new cards. The general game plan of this deck is using Lockjaw or our ramp pieces to cheat out some of these big threats, which naturally Skaar benefits from, reducing his cost going into the later turns of the game. So in terms of ramp, we have Wave, we have Psylocke, we have the Time Stone, and of course we have Lockjaw to toss away our stones and pull out some bigger things to hopefully get that Skaar cost down. We are running the Death and Killmonger package in here. Now you might be asking, why are we running Killmonger in a deck with Caiera? Well, the answer is pretty simple. With Thanos, you are not going to have as much consistency in seeing the same cards every game. So in the games where Killmonger is relevant for blowing up all the 1-drops on the board, including your own stones to make a cheaper death, aren't necessarily going to be the same games where you want to get your Caiera down to protect your big things. Killmonger is also really helpful in the mirror versus other Thanos decks, especially ones that are not running the Lockjaw package, as being able to blow up their stones. It's often very helpful, and it's just a generally good card against a lot of powerful 1-drops in the metagame right now. Caiera is here to help protect our stones when we don't want them blowing up, as well as protect our slew of 6-drops here, including Blob, Thanos, Skaar, and Magneto. We do add in another piece of ramp here in Psylocke, previously replacing Jeff, who's also pretty good in this list. But since we do want to focus on ramping out big things in order to get value off of Skaar, I think the extra piece of ramp is relevant here. Previous versions of Thanos were really focused on ramping out a powerful threat on 5, but there aren't that many good options on turn 5 for cards that are really big. Devil Dino's probably the best of the bunch here, especially when we're keeping our hand pretty decently large because of the stones. So instead, we're opting to use a combination of Wave and Psylocke here, so we have our ramp more often, so we can start ramping out our 6-drops instead of 5s. Though ramping out 5-drops can still be fine too. But yeah, as far as lists that are running both Skaar and Caiera, this is the one I am most excited to try. It's been a favorite archetype of mine for a long time. It's nice to see it come back a bit, and I'm really curious to see how Caiera affects the meta, if we can get away with dropping Shang-Chi from this deck, or if we'll have to adjust in the future to bring him back as a way to counter opponents also going for big stat strategies. Speaking of big stat strategies, that's what we've got here with Skaar's big boys. So the idea with this one is we are using Zabu to ramp out cards that have that 10 power, mainly being Namor, Atuma, and Typhoid Mary. You have to be a little careful with Typhoid Mary, as she will reduce the power of your other stuff if you still have her ongoing effect on her. So we do have 0 in here as a way to potentially turn that off. You could also consider Sauron, but that has negative blob synergy, so we opted not to go with that. Enchantress is another consideration here, as Enchantress is pretty good in the meta right now and could be an easy way to turn off Typhoid Mary, but we're opting to go all in on just trying to get Zabu out on 2. We're going to play our big stuff as early as turn 3, so we'll play down a 10 power card on turn 3, 10 power card on turn 4, big card on turn 5, and then we can play another card and Skaar on the final turn of the game for free, is kind of the dream here. We are running the Shuri Taskmaster Red Skull package, as it just makes sense in a big stats kind of deck, and Red Skull provides more fuel for our blob, as do our generally big cards that are here to help enable Skaar. We have Wave as an alternate way to ramp out a big thing, as well as just being pretty decent stats for the cost, and Armor as a means of protecting our big things, as well as making it so we don't have to have a lane on its own with Atuma. I've never been the biggest Shuri fan. I think it's just a little bit too linear for my tastes, but if you just like slamming down really big stuff and getting out that cheap Skaar, this should be a pretty solid deck. Then we have one of the decks I'm most excited about, and that is a Ronin Junk deck. So the idea with this one is we are trying to fill up the opponent's hand a bit, things like Master Mold and Maximus, using Iceman so it's harder for them to play their cards, And we have Gladiator here, who if we use Forge to buff him up, acts as an additional way to reduce the cost of our Skaar. Other enablers for Skaar here include Sentry and Ronin, who both are fairly solid threats in their own right, especially so with Sentry being combined with Annihilus. That Sentry Annihilus hood package is really solid, and I like having Cosmo in this deck a lot, not only as a way to protect our big threats, but also make cards like Sentry and Maximus not as bad when we don't have the other cards to make use of their synergies. Beast is kind of the experimental slot here. I think that's the card where you can try out a lot of different things in this slot. One card I think will probably be very strong going into this new season is going to be Mobius. Anytime a season pass card comes out and it is remotely playable, people like to spam it. So Mobius making it so your opponent can't reduce the cost of their Skaar and getting that collateral damage against other powerful decks like Sarah and Loki just seems generally really good. I think people are kind of sleeping on Mobius right now, and it seems especially relevant in a season where the season pass card is all about cost reduction. Also worth remembering, Master Mold is dropping to Series 3 shortly. He's dropping with the next patch, which I believe is expected on the 9th, so if you don't have Master Mold yet, but you want to play this deck, you only have to wait a little bit longer till he drops down and becomes available much more easily. But yeah, I played a similar version of this Ronin deck prior to Skaar's release. I really like it, and I think Skaar feels like a natural inclusion here. The deck isn't built around making him as cheap as possible, it's just built around doing generally strong things on its own, and having the nice addition here of a Skaar being a 4/11 or a 2/11 that can just help put more points onto the board. Another deck that I think can make use of Skaar in a similar way here is the Darkhawk Leech deck. So pretty standard Darkhawk core. We're using Ravonna and Zabu to reduce the costs of our Darkhawk and Mystique so we can get those out. And those two cards, along with the occasional Iron Lad, are going to be the ways we're trying to leverage getting Skaar down for cheaper. This is a deck where I think most of the time you are just going to be playing him as a 4/11, and I think you're generally going to be pretty okay with that. Leech is absolutely core in Darkhawk focused decks right now because of the prevalence of Blob. Blob just completely blanks your Darkhawks, and when we are relying on Darkhawk and Mystique a lot in this deck, you really need a way to make sure to turn that off before your opponent can get it down. The rest of the deck is pretty straightforward here. We just have the maximum amount of cards to enable our Darkhawk stuff, so Korg, Black Widow, and Rockslide. And Miss Marvel provides another solid threat that gives us another thing that our Mystique can copy for decent value. And then we have that Lad for an additional chance of high rolling, given the fact that most of the cards in our deck are pretty solid things to copy the on reveal of. Another direction you can go with the Darkhawk shell is the Moon Girl version. So we did see this deck seeing a bit of success about a month or so ago, and Skaar seems like it is a pretty natural inclusion for it. So the idea here is we are trying to double up on our Darkhawks and our She-Hulks. We get them into play on turn 5, and then we will have more Skaars to play on the final turn of the game. Zabu and Quinjet help a lot with reducing the cost of our more expensive cards. Ideally, you'd like to get Moon Girl off as early as turn 3 with Zabu. Then we can float on turn 4, slam a bunch of She-Hulks on turn 5, and then follow up with Skaars or Darkhawks, or even Miss Marvel. It's possible Miss Marvel might not be the best fit for this deck. It was good in the old version, but with adding Skaar, I'm not sure if it's going to still be quite as relevant. You may even want Magic in this deck to make it so you have another turn to do your combos, but Magic has kind of anti-synergy with Darkhawk, so we'll have to see how this deck feels before making further adjustments to it, but the core of it has already proven to be fairly strong before Skaar, and Skaar seems like a decent payoff for doubling up on your big She-Hulks and your big Darkhawks. Then we have a pretty standard high Evo Leech Sheot deck. This deck has been doing really well for a lot of people. You don't see people talk about it as much nowadays, but it's still a really solid deck that gets the job done. It hasn't changed very much in a while. The core has just been so strong, but I do think there is a legitimate argument for Caiera in this deck since you value your 1-drops and your 6-drops so heavily. Being able to make sure that they're protected across all lanes seems like it could be taking the spot of Cosmo, who has traditionally been your other piece of protection alongside armor. And if you happen to be a player who's getting all 3 of the new cards for the first time in this week's Spotlight Cache, this deck makes use of all of them in a pretty effective way, and it's relatively budget friendly, only having 2 cards in Series 3 outside of the Spotlight featured cards this week. Next up, we have a Zoo deck. So I've always been a fan of Zoo. Zoo is a term from other card games where it's basically you're just trying to spam a bunch of cheap cost creatures and overwhelm your opponent with it. Traditionally, Zoo has had a lot of trouble, mainly because of Killmonger or just not having enough points, so Caiera helps give us an answer to the Killmonger issue. We have ways to disrupt our opponents with things like Spider-Ham, Iceman, and Shang-Chi, and then just some basic cards to buff up our go-wide strategy in Skaar and Blue Marvel. Fast is really nice because it gives a solid boost to most of the cards in our deck, and is especially good synergy turning the hood from a negative to a positive, or we can hopefully get rid of the hood with Nico, destroying it to draw some cards. It's hard to say if Zoo is going to make the cut with how powerful some of the decks are right now, but if nothing else, I'm excited to try it because I think Zoo has always been kind of a personal favorite archetype, and I think Caiera is a very natural fit to include. Then we have a Caiera ramp deck. So the idea with this one is we are just a ramp deck. We're trying to cheat out big things. I've seen a few people posting a similar list with this kind of ramp blob tribunal stuff. Seems all right. We have a critical mass of very high power cards, so if we can get that blob out early and copy it, or a big blob into tribunal, seems very good. I'm still not overly sold on this being better than the full ongoing tribunal deck, but I do think if you just like ramping out big things into play, this is a pretty neat way of doing that, and Caiera provides some much needed protection that this deck is looking for. And we've got ongoing Thanos. So ongoing Thanos has never been the strongest of the bunch, but I do think it is a little bit underrated relative to its potential, and Caiera is just a very nice slot in here as it protects your stones. It gives you another ongoing thing that you can get boosted with our Spectrum towards the end of the game, and it's a deck that really is happy to be running Mobius, who, like previously mentioned, seems like he is going to capitalize very hard on the fact that there is not only a decent amount of cost reduction stuff going around right now, but that the Season Pass card is all about cost reduction. We are using the nerfed Professor X as generally having ways to buff him up later, like Spectrum or Blue Marvel, or even just sneaking Jeff into the lane seems very good. And this basically plays out like a old school Thanos ongoing deck, but with just a little bit more top end and things like Devil Dino and Spectrum. Next up, we have Skaar Wave. So the idea with this one is we are another ramp deck, but instead of focusing on things like Electro, we are using mainly Psylocke and Wave as our main ramp pieces. Cheat out something big like Magneto or Blob early, or we can even go the Sunspot route with floating into Infinite She-Hulk. Psylocke's kind of cool here as we can use Psylocke on turn 4 to get 6 energy for turn 5, and that'll allow us to play our She-Hulk and Infinite on turn 6. If Magic is enabling a turn 7 game, then we can play Skaar for very little cost. And Blob just benefits a lot from the fact that we're running some pretty big static cards in the deck. We have Armor and Caiera acting as our main forms of protection, and Enchantress being our main tech card of choice here, as it doesn't negatively impact our game plan at all really, but it can be good against opposing Ms. Marvels or Tribunal combo decks. And the last deck of the bunch is Dracula Zoo. So this was one that was popular a while ago. It's a version of Zoo I've always liked. The main idea here is we're trying to play out our hand, leave one card remaining in Red Skull or Infinite so we get big value out of Dracula. Storm lets us close down a lane, which is often where we're going to be slamming the Dracula, though sometimes we can just fill it up with good 1-drops that scale, like Nebula, Sunspot, or even a zeroed Martyr. Skaar helps us buff our go-wide board here, but we do generally like keeping the curve of this deck low to the ground, as we don't want to end up with cards we can't play, because then the Dracula gets a lot worse. Echo helps out a ton here, just being a good 1-drop we can play down in the middle to shut off opposing Ms. Marvels. Squirrel Girl helps us go wide, and we're trying out Martyr here, as I like having 0 as a 1-drop for Red Skull in the games where we want to play him out, rather than rely on Dracula to get him into play power-wise. And I felt like there generally wasn't a ton of good other things to pair with 0, but Martyr seems like a natural choice. You could also go with Titania, does a similar thing as a 1/5 that benefits with 0. I think the downside of Martyr isn't always quite as bad as Titania might be in the games where you're not turning off the effect. And there we have it. That is going to wrap it up for our day 1 decks for Skaar and Caiera. Let me know what you think about these cards and decks in the comments below, and I'd love to know what you think about this new release cycle where we are seeing the first week of a season not only have the new season past card, but also a new card coming via Spotlights. That's going to wrap it up for this one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.